Welcome to the Authority File, the podcast where you'll hear conversations with academic librarians, technologists, researchers, and authors whose work is laying the foundation for higher education's future. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this four-part series, which is brought to you with support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press, we'll be speaking with the co-editors of the new book, The Contemporary Leonard Cohen, Response, Reappraisal, and Rediscovery. Kate Pinder, Associate Professor in the Department of English and Theatre at Acadia University, where she teaches Canadian Literature and Literary Theory, and Joel Deshay, Associate Professor of Canadian Literature and Film at Memorial University in St. John's, Newfoundland, joined my colleague and Choice's digital media producer Sabrina Kofer to discuss the Canadian musician, poet, and novelist Leonard Cohen. The book examines Cohen as an artist through a contemporary lens, allowing contributors a chance to, as the book's subtitle notes, reappraise and rediscover his creative output and influence in a post-20th century context. Sabrina, Kate, and Joel talk about how the book came together and take time to explain several of Cohen's works and show how a contemporary critical stance on Cohen illuminates his work in a very different light. In this second episode of our series, our guests discuss Cohen's lesser-known and intentionally controversial book of poetry, Flowers for Hitler. They also spotlight Cohen's use of gossip and rumor in his songs, particularly in the context of his relationship with Joni Mitchell.
I'd like to talk about both of your chapters in the book. So, Kate, could you introduce us to your chapter, Untimely Meditations, Critical History and Flowers for Hitler? Could you also sort of set the scene for those unfamiliar with what Flowers for Hitler is and maybe why it's not as well known or as talked about as his other works?
Yes. Okay. I'm excited to talk about my chapter. Thank you for asking about it. This actually is a chapter that I started a really long time ago. And it just so happens that it's become more interesting and relevant, I think, as time has gone on. So my chapter, as you noted, is about this collection of poems called Flowers for Hitler, which Cohen published in 1964. And you can tell even from the title that it's intends to be controversial, going back to Joel's earlier point about in the last discussion about how Cohen was at first a kind of controversial artist. So my chapter is really drawing on this small book of poetry that most people have never heard of, and I read it through Friedrich Nietzsche's essay on the uses and disadvantages of history for life. And that essay by Nietzsche is often referred to as his second untimely meditation. So he has a book of untimely meditations, and this is the second essay that appears in that book, and so it gets called the second untimely meditation. And I was really inspired by what Nietzsche said about untimeliness in that essay in particular. He says that in his own work, untimeliness is looking afresh at something of which our time is rightly proud, its cultivation of history, as being something injurious to it, a defect and a deficiency in it. And so I saw Cohen doing something similar in Flowers for Hitler, in the sense that he's looking back at the recent history of the two world wars and the way Canadians were feeling about those wars, usually a kind of like moral superiority. The First World War is often mythologized in Canada as the moment that Canada becomes a nation on the world stage. And the Second World War gets memorialized, I think, for a lot of the Allied nations as a righteous war because of the Holocaust. And so, Canadians and others fought against Hitler and won, and that makes Canadians good and Hitler evil. And so Cohen in the book is really, I think, drawing on these, what I see as Nietzschean ideas about history. So in his history essay, Nietzsche talks about different kinds of history, and his whole point is that different approaches to history can be disadvantageous, or they can be useful. And the whole argument for Nietzsche is like what produces new things and what makes life more possible. So Nietzsche is like a philosopher of life. And so I argue that Cohen develops a critical persona in the book. And for Nietzsche, a critical historical perspective brings the past into a kind of tribunal. So judges the past and is really kind of scrupulous about its judgments of the past. It doesn't let anybody off the hook. And I say that Cohen takes up this critical mantle to condemn what he sees as monumental history in Canada. And monumental history for Nietzsche is a kind of like ideological appropriation of history that turns, devastating events into literally monuments that get celebrated for nationalistic purposes. So we just had Remembrance Day in Canada on November 11th. Quite recently. And the poppy becomes a symbol of remembrance. But for Cohen, the poppy is an ideological symbol. It is the flowers, the bouquet that the poems are delivering to Hitler is actually a bouquet of poppies. And so there's a lot of important symbolism in that book. So it's a complicated argument, but I think it helps us make sense of this book that is not read very often. And there are three reasons why I think that book is not read as often or not as well known as some of Cohen's other works. So first of all, the poems can appear quite slight and even superficial or basic, you might say. There's sometimes like childish language that's used. And so if you don't understand the context that would inspire a poet to write this way, and how even though there's sort of simple poems, they have this really heavy message, I don't think you can appreciate, I think it personally as a reader, it was harder for me to appreciate the value of the poetry until I understood that broader context. The second point is it's antagonistic and offensive, and Cohen knew that it would offend people and make them angry, and he did it anyway. He said that it would move him into the dung pile. He's a frontline writer writing from the dung pile in this collection, and only his contemporaries, only his peers would recognize the merits of his work. So he was quite prepared for people to read the book and think it was awful and dismiss it. And this sort of is like one of the disadvantages, Nietzsche would say, of the critical stance, though, because if your intention or the goal of your writing or anything else you're doing is just critique, and there's no hope and there's no life, people might be detached, and Nietzsche, and I think Cohen also sees a limitation in that. And so my third answer for why this book is, not as well known is that it was surpassed in 1966 by Cohen's novel Beautiful Losers, which takes up a lot of the same themes, includes some of rewritings of some of the poems. But importantly, I think, and Gregory Betts talks about this in the chapter in the book, it's kind of a transition from my chapter, but importantly, it's a devastating novel, but it's also way more hopeful than Flowers for Hitler. There is like this life-affirming aspect of that book that I think, Flowers for Hitler doesn't have, and I think it causes a problem maybe for some readers. And then also I think for Cohen, he had to write himself out of just anger, because if all you have is anger and condemnation, you're probably not going to create too many new things, and that's a problem for an artist.
Right. Yeah. Great.
Not to try to explain Kate's chapter at all, but just to pick up on what she was just saying, Cohen's little hopeful moment in Beautiful Losers backslides in the 1970s, in the early 70s with The Energy of Slaves, which is a period of intense personal turmoil for Cohen, leading to his Death of a Ladies' Man album, which is some people think his worst album. But I think by that time, he's also gearing up toward a kind of recovery that recaptures some of the hope of Beautiful Losers with the book version of Death of a Ladies' Man, which ends with this exhortation to long live the one heart. And it's easy to read that ironically and sarcastically, but the book is a kind of tour de force, and I think recovers a lot of that spirit that he had lost in the early 70s. I think there are lots of ups and downs in his career that the book charts through various chapters.
Great. Okay, yeah. So, Joel, your chapter looks at Cohen's relationship with gossip and rumor in his songs and life, particularly through his relationship with Joni Mitchell. So, why did you choose to look at that relationship, and how can rumor and gossip feed into the interpretations of Cohen and Mitchell's songwriting?
I was just really simply curious about the extent of their relationship, and I knew from the biographies of those writers that some songs by both of them were allegedly about the other, and I started looking into that, and then I started to notice something about how Cohen and Mitchell were writing their songs around the time of their relationship in 1967. And those songs then emerged in, I think, 1971 on a couple of their albums from that year. And I noticed that they were using a kind of phrase over and over again. And the phrase was, I heard somebody say something else. Or somebody said, this is what happened. And that kind of phrase is the phrase that we use when we share gossip. And then when we share it widely enough, it becomes a kind of rumor. It becomes more like a rumor through publicity. That's one of the sort of secondary positions of that chapter. But basically what I was interested in was how often that phrase I heard showed up in Cohen's work. And there are lots of examples, and I have a big list in the chapter. But the most famous one is when he sings, I heard there was a secret chord that David played and it pleased the Lord. But you don't really care for music, do you? Right? That's the line. And I thought, oh yeah, like basically it's all about gossip. It's about hearsay. It's about the things people say to each other informally or casually that might still have something important, like a secret in them. And then when I started doing some research into this, thanks in part to my friend and a former professor of mine, Ned Shantz at McGill University, who had been studying gossip in a bigger context, I started to realize that gossip is often stereotyped as a feminine discourse and a way of talking that women use. And, conveniently, men's own uses of gossip are typically ignored when we think about gossip. And so here I am thinking, what if Cohen is learning this style of communicating through somebody like Joni Mitchell, who's also using those kinds of phrases in her songs?
Right.
It helps to do a couple of things. First of all, it sort of reduces that emphasis on Cohen's masculinity that we often see in fan appreciations and even critical statements about his work. He's often depicted as a ladies' man and depicts himself as a ladies' man, but I think in some ways his approaches to art are not as masculine as they might appear all the time. And then the other thing going on, and this is really important, is that Cohen, like a lot of writers of his status, or stature, if you think of his giant images on the murals of Montreal's buildings. But when we think of writers like that, we think of them as geniuses, as people who are singular. And, that's a word that is often associated with genius, a singular genius. Somebody who managed to do all that creative stuff on his own. And I think this discourse of gossip breaks down that idea and says, you know what? You need to have a lot of people working together to be creative most of the time. And it's not just about one person who can do it all. And so that whole idea of the contemporaries in our book is there partly to take a critical stance on this idea of Cohen as a genius who had sort of come into the world without any influences, without seeking connections to other people. That's just not true. And I also like this idea of Cohen's, shared creative processes, because it links to the interdisciplinarity that we talked about earlier. It's really hard to be interdisciplinary if you're just doing the work on your own. Usually you're seeking somebody else out who can work with you for the purposes of some project. So I didn't expect this when I started that chapter, but in the end, I was happy that it had brought a critical edge to our readings of Cohen and helped to make his career understandable in a more inclusive way.
I might even go a little bit further, Joel, in my summary of what your chapter accomplishes, if I can, just in the way you're talking about it, really draws attention to the fact that, all the saintly image of Cohen is also this prophetic image of Cohen. And what people are sometimes drawn to is, I heard there was a secret chord, I have God has my ear there. I have some kind of, intimacy with divine speech. But what your chapter is demonstrating is that is not a kind of prophetic speech in these statements that he's making. It's rumor and gossip and hearsay and those sorts of things, which are much more human in the sense that they speak to a community. They're not about a genius who is the only person who has access to some divine truth on an authority that can't be questioned. And so I like the this contrast to the other image of Cohen that I think is much more predominant. And it's the one that, when Kate McKinnon is singing Hallelujah as Hillary Clinton, she's drawing on that image. It's that voice of God through Cohen, through Kate McKinnon, through Hillary Clinton, through Kate McKinnon. But even that line is, a broken telephone in a lot of ways. So I think it's a really emblematic chapter in the sense that it shifts the way we think about creation.
Yeah, thank you, Kate. Well, that's very nice of you. And to put the credit where it is due, it's Joni Mitchell who sings about Cohen and takes down that image of the angel. In fact, one of her songs depicts Cohen as a creature with bat wings, right? So she's implying in a couple of different places, at least, that he's a devil figure and not an angel or a saint. And I guess that's another element of the critical edge of that chapter.
You just heard from Kate Pinder, Associate Professor in the Department of English and Theatre at Acadia University, and Joel Deshay, Associate Professor of Canadian Literature and Film at Memorial University in St. John's, Newfoundland. Kate and Joel are co-editors of the contemporary Leonard Cohen, Response, Reappraisal, and Rediscovery, recently published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press, which provided support for this series. Join us next week when our guests discuss what Cohen's legacy means in his home country of Canada, how the title's contributors reflect Cohen's global impact, and why it's so important to examine Cohen from a critical point of view. As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.